Welcome back to The Income Generation, the show where we share valuable financial information for that critical period in life when you're either in or approaching retirement. I'm David Scranton, your host. As regular viewers might remember, earlier this year we did a show focusing on elections. In that show, I shared some disturbing facts and figures about career politicians. And we talked about the many ways in which they impact the economy, the financial markets, our laws, and yes, our lives. At that time, the landscape of this year's election was still very foggy. So with the picture now much, much clearer, we're revisiting this topic on today's show. Today we'll be talking specifically about some of the things at stake in this year's election and how the choice of one candidate over the other could potentially impact you, members of the income generation. As our guest today, author Dick Morris, puts it, the stakes for working Americans and the economy overall have never been higher than they are for this election. It's hard to argue with that when you consider that some of the factors involved are as follows: our national debt, immigration, employment, and the future of Medicare and Social Security, just to name a few. Dick Morris served as an advisor to career politicians Bill and Hillary Clinton for 20 years. And the title of his latest book makes it pretty clear which outcome he feels would be worse for the economy and the country in general. His book, currently a bestseller, is called Armageddon: How Trump Can Beat Hillary. Among the disturbing statistics that his book points out is that there are now some 114 million full-time workers in this country compared to 107 million on public assistance. And public assistance, we do not mean Social Security or Medicare. We mean welfare, food stamps, and Medicaid. When President Obama took office, the ratio was 137 million working, compared to only 70 million on welfare. Dick Morris believes that under a Hillary Clinton presidency, those figures would continue moving in the wrong direction until, in short order, the number of net contributors to the system would be fewer than the number of net takers. In essence, we're going to lose control of our own country, is what I hear you say, I believe.
Exactly. And the third thing is that the number of people on welfare will pass the number of people who work.
Yes. It's a scary thought when you consider the potential impact on income tax rates, our already ridiculously unbalanced federal budget, and our out-of-control national debt. Making matters worse is the potential for Hillary to try to appease Bernie Sanders supporters with her plans to reform, or as today's guest puts it, deform, two programs that retirees and near retirees depend upon dearly, and that is Social Security and Medicare. According to Dick Morris, her plans have the potential to spur an intergenerational war over Social Security taxes and to burden our Medicare system with all the problems plaguing Obamacare until the system finally implodes. As Dick Morris sees it, the dangerous economic trend of borrowing against our children's future to recklessly fund the present would continue under Hillary Clinton. And before too long, we'd become a dependent nation, moving ever so much closer to the fate of Greece and other European nations now struggling with massive debt and potential bankruptcy. Again, those are some scary thoughts, I understand, but there's really no debating that our economy and federal budgetary system have serious problems that need addressing. Voters, in fact, have a huge responsibility this fall to make sure that the candidate they elect is one who's going to fix those problems, or at least make them better instead of worse. You'll learn more about some of these problems and issues and what's specifically at stake in this year's election for the income generation on today's Market Breakdown. This is fun. This is great. 3, 2, 1. I'd like to take a few seconds and tell you why I decided to write the book entitled Return on Principle. Basically, it all boils down to this. Let's face it, you deserve to live a happy retirement. It's as simple as that. But for many, the subject of money, finance, and math is complicated. Here's a fun fact. Many Americans claim that they'd much rather clean a toilet than calculate a tip in a restaurant. Thank you, I guess. But it doesn't have to be that complicated. Using the 7 core values I outline in my book, you too who will be able to build a life based upon the right core principles. Cut. Return on Principle isn't just a book about financial investing, it's about investing in your life. I know for a fact that you're going to love it. Okay, now it's just getting a little weird here. So when we talk about this year's election determining whether or not we become another Greece, you might be asking, is this just election year hype, or is it really accurate? In fact, the same goes for talk about crippling Social Security and Medicare and creating an intergenerational tax war. Could that really happen? Yes, those are fair questions to ask. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to break down some numbers that should help provide an answer. The bottom line, though, is that yes, the stakes might actually be that high. And if you're part of the income generation, that means you're retired or within 10 years of retirement, it means you not only have to think about making the right choice this November, but about making the right savings and investment choices for these troubled times. As I've said many times on this show, we really are in uncharted waters today with our economy, our federal budget, and our financial markets. In fact, it's one of the reasons this entire election has been so contentious and in many ways unprecedented. The country is at a crossroads, and the outcome of this election could have major financial implications for the nation as a whole and for you as someone saving for retirement. So, as to the country's potential for becoming another Greece, depending on the next president's policies, let's look at where we stand right now. Yes, again, I've talked about the debt bubble on previous shows, but let me go over some of the numbers one more time. Our total debt here in the great United States of America at the moment stands at a whopping $19.3 trillion, having risen from an already massive $900 billion in the late 1980s. That debt currently represents just over 104% of the country's GDP, or gross domestic product. As I've explained before, that number is important because government debt as a percentage of GDP is often used by investors or by creditors to gauge a country's ability to make future payments on what it owes. That, of course, impacts borrowing costs and bond yields. As a general rule, if a country's debt to GDP ratio exceeds 77% for an extended period of time, investors start to worry. Ours surpassed 100% in 2012 and now stands, again, at a whopping 104%. By comparison, Greece's debt to GDP was at 146% when it was finally forced to radically restructure its debt or go bankrupt. So on the one hand, you still might think, well, we've got a long way to go. But on the other hand, consider that the debt to GDP ratio has increased steadily and dramatically over the past decade, up from 64% just 10 years ago. And with a government in place that refuses to take steps to get our debt under control, or worse yet, one that keeps increasing it, it's a safe bet that we're going to get to that 146% number soon enough. It's worth pointing out here that our national credit rating has already been downgraded by one of the three major credit rating agencies 5 years ago. Standard & Poor's lowered our rating from AAA to AA for the first time ever, partly because of its concerns about our rising debt burden. And if all those official debt numbers aren't scary enough, think about this. According to a 2013 economic study, the government has an additional $70 trillion in off-balance sheet debts that aren't even included in that official debt figure. Off-balance sheet debts include trust fund programs like Social Security, Medicare, government pensions, as well as actions taken by the Federal Reserve, things involving housing support, as well as other federal loan guarantees. And if you factored in all those commitments, our national debt would be more than 6 times the reported figure, almost $100 trillion according to this report. Odds are that number has only gotten worse since the study was conducted. Which brings us back to Social Security and Medicare and how these programs might potentially be impacted under a Clinton presidency. As you'll hear our guest Dick Morris talk about in the next segment, Hillary Clinton's plans for Social Security, which include reducing the eligibility age all the way down to age 55, could potentially overburden the system until the only option for keeping it solvent would be significant increases in Social Security taxes. Her proposed changes to Medicare, along with her policies on other social programs as well as immigration, could have similar repercussions, meaning tax increases across the board. So what might this mean for our age group saving for retirement or in retirement? Well, here are a few possibilities to consider. IRAs and 401ks, for example, represent one of the largest asset classes for most members of the income generation. And right now, the government provides certain tax incentives for you to save for retirement through these types of vehicles. But if the government needs more money, it might become less generous in how it taxes your retirement accounts. And many of you would probably argue that it isn't all that generous right now with how it's already taxing them. So let me give you a hypothetical example. Let's say you have $1 million sitting in an IRA now, and unfortunately you die. Taxes are generally due, income taxes, within 5 years after death at a current rate of 40%. That means that of that $1 million, your heirs will get about $600,000 and the government gets $400,000. But if the government needs more money, the laws could simply change and instantly flip that obligation around, meaning the IRS would take 60% and your heirs would get just 40%, simply by raising marginal tax brackets. And possibly even shorten the number of years it takes for those taxes to be paid. So at the stroke of a pen in Congress, the IRS just took another $200,000 out of your IRA, and there's absolutely nothing that you can do about it. How about estate taxes? Well, as I pointed out on a recent show, right now the government threshold for estate taxes is over $5 million, meaning that you don't owe any estate tax if your net worth is less than that. But if the government needs more money, it could lower that threshold to $3 million, $2 million, or even $1 million, where it already stands in many states when we're talking about state estate taxes. Another option could be to hit you with new taxes on capital gains. You see, right now, for example, if a stock or a home that you bought for $100,000, it has appreciated and is worth as much as $1 million by the time you die, your heirs actually inherit this with no capital gains tax. It's called a step-up in basis. But if the government needs more money, one consequence could very well be that your heirs now get hit with capital gains taxes on all those appreciated assets that you've held during your lifetime. Now, of course, these are all just possibilities, but the bottom line is this. If we should end up with a government this fall whose policies not only don't attempt to fix our current fiscal problems, but actually do things to make them even worse than they already are, there will be significant repercussions. And truth be told, tax increases might just be the least of them. Another concern I've talked about related to the debt bubble is the threat of hyperinflation. Now, we haven't had any problems with inflation for the last several years, but think about this. If our national credit rating remains bad for so long that other countries lose confidence in our ability to pay our debts, the dollar could plunge in value and we could lose our status as the world reserve currency. The result could very well be hyperinflation, which would be really an insidious erosion of the value of a lot of Americans' retirement savings. In the end, if we keep moving in the direction of Greece becoming a dependent nation with more citizens who take from the system than contribute to it, then we run the risk of sharing Greece's fate. We run the risk of collapsing our economy and our stock market, losing our status as a global leader and bankrupting not just our country, but our children's and grandchildren's futures. Again, as a member of the income generation, I suggest that you have two important questions to think about in light of all this. First, what are you going to do to help and protect your country this fall? And secondarily, what are you going to do to help and protect yourself and your retirement savings today? Stay with us after a commercial break. We'll be right back with our special guest today, Dick Morris. If you're not using someone who's well trained in fixed income and you're born before 1966, it may just be time for you to break up with that advisor and move on. I would suggest someone who will care for you through these important years of your life. If you need help finding someone, call or write us. I'd also like to remind you of the special report entitled The Income Generation. This is available free to you, our loyal viewers, online. If you haven't downloaded your report, pick it up after the show. If you're near or in retirement, head over to theincomegeneration.com and download your special report written specifically for the needs of the income generation, again, those born before 1966. I'm David Scranton, and you've been watching The Income Generation. Welcome back. For today's timely show, we have an extremely timely guest. Dick Morris served as a special advisor and political consultant to both Bill and Hillary Clinton for 20 years. In fact, he's said to know their strengths, their weaknesses, and even their deepest secrets. All that inside knowledge plays a major role in his latest book entitled Armageddon: How Trump Can Beat Hillary. Dick is a co-author of 6 New York Times bestsellers in all and a regular political commentator on Fox News and other networks. Thanks for joining us, Dick.
Thanks, but it's 12 times bestsellers.
12 times. Gosh, well, I'm sorry to shortchange you by 50%. Given the topic and title of your book, I imagine you're in extreme demand these days as a talk show guest. Explain why you called your book Armageddon.
Well, because I think that this is the ultimate fight of good against evil. And I do feel, in a certain sense, it's the last battle. If we lose this election, there will never be another. And by that, I do not mean that we'll become a dictatorship, but I do mean that Hillary will let 10 or 12 million currently illegal immigrants vote and appoint Supreme Court judges that will sustain that, and will never win another election for 20 years. I do mean by that that she'll let millions of immigrants and refugees in, seeding our country with potential terrorists. And we'll be like France. We'll be unable to exorcise this plague because it will have taken such hold in our midst.
You're saying, in essence, we're going to lose control of our own country, is what I hear you say, I believe.
Exactly. And the third thing is that the number of people on welfare will pass the number of people who work.
Yes.
Right now, there are 107 on welfare, not counting Social Security or Medicare, but Medicaid, food stamps, welfare, and the like. 107 million, and the number of full-time working is 114. When Obama took office, it was 70 on welfare and 137 who work. Under Hillary, those lines will cross. So whether it's the becoming a dependent population or being seeded with potential terrorists, or whether it's packing the electorate, this is, in a sense, the last election.
Interesting. So I know in your book you talk about a dozen reasons why Hillary should not be president. I know you've just highlighted a couple. If you could give us a few more, the ones that are perhaps the strongest reasons, I'd love to hear them.
Well, first, she's a compulsive and pathological liar. Whether it's saying that she was named after Sir Edmund Hillary, or that she landed under sniper fire in Bosnia, or that she didn't send or receive classified emails, or saying that she wanted to enlist in the military as a Marine. Her life is just festooned with fantasy stories that are not reality. And Hillary, when pressed, rarely tells the truth. Secondly, she failed her test as commander-in-chief. In Benghazi, we had a perfect example of how she would work were she president. She ignored the warnings, she did not reinforce the garrison, and when the attack was underway, she turned her back. I think that she is also fundamentally corrupt. I think that the Clintons became sort of a RICO, a racketeering organization, where Bill collected speaking fees that were really thinly disguised bribes, And Hillary took actions as Secretary of State to pay off the people that made the payoffs. For example, when Putin wanted to buy 20% of the U.S. uranium reserves, they paid Bill $1 million to give 2 speeches in Moscow. And as soon as the million was deposited in Hillary's account, she okayed the deal. I think she knows nothing at all about economics. She's never talked about economics. It's never been one of her things, and that's going to be a crucial issue. I think she's pro-Muslim. I think that she's unduly influenced by Abedin, her closest associate, who has a long history of involvement in radical Muslim activities, was raised in Saudi Arabia, and her mother is the editor of a journal that includes a lot of jihadist material. I think that Hillary lives in a bubble. I think by a combination of her White House and her Arkansas mansion tenure and State Department, she's become removed from the average person, doesn't share our lives, doesn't understand our problems. And I've got a whole bunch of others in the book.
We need to take a break in just about a minute, but before that, our show is aimed at retirees and near retirees primarily. Can you give us the Cliff Notes version at this point of how you think a Clinton presidency would impact them specifically?
Well, I think that she's going to take 2 systems on which retirees depend and fundamentally deform them, Social Security and Medicare, where we will need to go to your break before I can fully explain it. But let me say with Medicare, she wants to lower the eligibility to 55, and eventually she wants to expand it to everybody, a single-payer system. And that will take a well-functioning system of Medicare and turn it on its head. The number of patients demanding care will soar. The number of doctors able to give the care will be limited. You'll get the same problems in Obamacare in Medicare. It'll spread the contagion that has basically ruined Obamacare and is causing it to implode. Lack of patient care, lack of doctors, lack of accessibility, and spread it to Medicare. When we come back, let's talk Social Security.
That's a great idea. It's a great segue into the break. Thank you very much, Dick Morse. We'll be right back, and when we are, we're going to actually talk a little bit about how Dick believes that a Trump presidency would be better, and whether or not Donald Trump, although Dick believes he can win the election, whether or not he can actually run the country. We'll be right back after the break. Stay with us.
Read David J. Scranton's groundbreaking new book, Return on Principle, 7 Core Values to Help Protect Your Money in Good Times and Bad. Discover practical solutions to the financial challenges facing today's generation of retirees and near retirees. Learn the truth about Wall Street, the financial media, and the secrets they try to hide from everyday investors. This isn't just another book about investing. Working Americans who have lived through 2 major stock market crashes and the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression in the past 16 years don't need another book about investing. David Scranton's approach to financial planning is a holistic system designed for maximum protection, strategic growth, and reliable income regardless of market conditions. Stop planning for retirement with your fingers crossed. Read Return on Principle, 7 Core Values to Help Protect Your Money in Good Times and Bad. Available now.
Welcome back. We're here today with Dick Morse, author of the new book, Armageddon, How Trump Can Beat Hillary. Dick, let's talk about the economy specifically for just a minute.
Before we promised the viewers we'd talk about Social Security, just to finish the answer to your last question.
Perfect segue. That's where I was actually headed.
Hillary's plans will really endanger Social Security because she is being pushed to the left by Bernie Sanders people and is going to have to expand Social Security to a point where its financial stability will be in serious jeopardy. For all the propaganda about Social Security being in trouble, it's really not. Social Security is in fairly decent shape, and we have large numbers of younger people, largely immigrants, coming into the country, and eventually interest rates will recover and the fund will be all right. But it's a thinly balanced thing. And if we expand Social Security, as she is urging, which is to lower the retirement age when we really need to be raising it, and using Social Security to kind of fill the gap between when your 20 or 30-year career is over and age 65, that late 50s, 60s period. That's a population equal in size to those over 65. And if the Social Security system is burdened with that, the only way it can finance itself is by a significant increase in Social Security taxes. Right now, Social Security taxes do not cause much political havoc because they're only on the first 125 or so of income. But when they take that lid off and they raise the rate to accommodate the changes that Hillary wants to make, it's going to become an enormous burden, an enormous political issue, and sort of an intergenerational war.
Certainly. Wow, that's a mouthful. But now let's pivot. Let's talk about how a Trump presidency would actually be better for the retirees and pre-retirees, the members of the income generation that watch our show every week.
Well, I think that people do not understand the real Donald Trump. I know him very well. My father was his lawyer, and I've known him all my life. And Trump is not an ideologue. He certainly is not a proto-fascist like the left wants to make out. He's not a bigot. He's not a racist. He's a builder. He's a developer. His motto is basically get it built, get it done. I don't care whether it's left or right, make it happen. He's someone who is accustomed to getting stuff built and done and brushing aside the obstacles in his path. LaGuardia once said there's no Democratic or Republican way to clean the streets. And I think that that's Trump's motto. In a sense, Trump is basically saying, just give me the damn ball and let me get this stuff done. And I think that whereas Hillary would be government by committee and would be continuously influenced by all of the winds of political opinion, I think Trump will be focused on getting certain objectives met, reducing the deficit, bringing down the debt, restoring American competitiveness abroad, stopping illegal immigration into this country, stopping the refugee flows that jeopardize us, and enhancing our intelligence and national security capabilities. And I think those are crucially important to all Americans and to the audience of your show.
Okay. So what do you say to all the viewers who in some ways really want to vote for Trump, whether it's a vote for Trump or a vote against Hillary, but are afraid to pull that lever because they're afraid that Trump might be, as some say, too risky of a candidate? What would you say to those voters?
I would say that they have to recognize that, in Dylan's words, the times they are changing. Yeah. And the average person in the world is not prepared to sit back and let those who run the global economy continue to run it into the ground. They look at the record of the global economy. They look at the dysfunctional nature that it's assumed. And they no longer trust the elites, the IMF, the European Union, the World Bank, the UN, the Federal Reserve Board. They want a government that looks out for them, a government that's more nationalistic than global and puts the needs of the American people first. And I think Trump is going to do that. And I think that the Trump campaign will bring a reform in its wake that will assuage those concerns. Whereas if we go to Hillary, we will just make matters worse and ultimately lead to a more significant and perhaps destructive reckoning. The same impetus that led Britain to leave the European Union is leading Sanders and Trump voters to take over their parties and to demand an end to government by these elites in their own self-interest.
Well, and economically speaking, I think you said it best when you said that 114 million citizens are, at this point, really net contributors to the economy, and 107 million are net takers. And when that flips over in the other direction, all of a sudden we turn potentially into Greece or a Greece-like situation. So
retirees have to understand how delicately balanced Social Security is and Medicare is. There is no great resentment against it in the American economy now. There's no war on senior citizens. But yet, over half of our federal budget goes to the elderly. Over half. And if you take out debt service, it's almost 2/3 between Social Security and Medicare. And and if that is expanded, as Hillary wants to do, it's going to cause fiscal havoc, huge tax levels,
Sure.
and go down the same rat hole that Detroit is in or Greece is in.
Exactly.
More taxes on those who can pay, and therefore less and less productivity.
Exactly. Dick, we need to leave it there, unfortunately. Time flies when you're having fun. I appreciate your insight, and I just received your book yesterday, but I absolutely cannot wait to read it. So thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you.
Great. All right, stay with us. We'll be right back with more between myself and Morgan. We'll be right back. If you're near or in retirement, head over to theincomegeneration.com and download your special report written specifically for the needs of the income generation. Again, those born before 1966. I'm David Scranton, and you've been watching The Income Generation.
Welcome back to The Income Generation. Now, David, you talk a lot about debt to GDP. Can you explain a little bit more about that for our viewers in case they're not really getting what you're talking about?
Sure. The national debt is basically, you take the total national debt, not our annual debt service, not our annual interest, but our total national debt, and you divide it by the GDP, which GDP is the equivalent of income to an individual.
Okay.
So think of it this way. If you were a household and you had a $100,000 mortgage and you had a $100,000 income, it would be very much like having 100% debt to GDP ratio, because you have 100,000 of debt, 100,000 of income. That's 1/1, which is 100%.
And U.S. as a country, that's pretty much where we're at, right? 100%?
A little bit over 100%, that's correct.
Okay. So that doesn't seem like such a bad thing to me. So if I make $100,000, I have a $100,000 mortgage, why is that so bad?
Yeah, you're right. When you put it in individuals' terms, it doesn't sound as bad. But here's the thing I think that everyone has to remember. First of all, the reality is that when you have debts in your household, you can cut back your expenses more easily.
Right.
You can make a decision to not go out to dinner. You can make a decision to not travel and cut down those variable expenses. And that's why a lot of mortgage companies, for example, will approve of 40% debt service to income, where if you're making $100,000, you could have a mortgage payment of $40,000 a year. But think about it as a country. Can we just cut back our expenses? Can we just cut back without virtually an act of Congress our defense spending?
Nope.
Can we just cut back our welfare programs?
Nope.
No. So you see, if anything, what happens is new spending measures pop in, new spending measures that we didn't really expect. And those spending measures then actually force us to have to spend more money, which is how we continuously get pulled into more and more debt over time. So 100% may not sound bad when you're making an analogy to an individual.
Right.
But the reality of it is that when you're looking at a country has less flexibility. If they're already up to here, to cut back expenses, you really have to pass some legislation. And as long as politicians are going to be politicians, they're not going to want to take away benefits if they want to get reelected.
That's true. But you know, every politician has their own idea of how we are going to cut back spending so we can, you know, make things improve a little bit. So is that why it's so important to really focus on the election and focus on who's talking about taking what? Because if your pie is like this, something's got to come from somewhere. So you have to really pick and choose where it's going to come from.
That's right. That's right. It's important that we focus on this election, I believe, the economy as really a primary issue. And, you know, I think that's why this election has been so crazy and so different from most, is because people are realizing, wait a minute, we have to do something different. Doing the same old stuff we've always done is going to get us the same old result. And we're at a pace right now in terms of how our debt to GDP is growing. We're literally in about 7 or 8 years, we'll have the same debt to GDP that Greece had right when it became insolvent.
You know, I heard that, and that's a little bit scary. I know a lot of people don't really believe that. We've talked before about irrational exuberance as an investor or as a thought process as an investor. But do you think we're facing irrational exuberance as a nation? Saying, you know, oh, it won't happen to us. It'll be different. This is never going to happen to us. Things are going to be fine. It's going to work out.
Well, there's always people who think that this time it's going to be different. You know, for example, I remember, and you remember, 1999, we had the technology bubble in the stock market. I'm going to make a stock market analogy, but people said, hey, the stock market's going to go to the moon this time. We know it's never done it, but this time it's going to go to the moon. We have this new technology called computers and the internet and so on and so forth. Well, the reality of it is we've always had technology, and technology has always been the excuse for some very, very smart people saying that this time it's going to be different. In the stock market, for example, we had a bear market back, in the 1800s, and back then people used the excuse that, well, now we have trains. People can put our goods and services on trains. We could ship them all the way across the country, and with this technology of trains, this time it's going to be different. Then we later had the trucking industry when we had the Depression, where people now said, okay, well, with the trucking industry, we could take our goods off of trains, and now we could ship them via trucks to the most remote corners of the world, where now, with this new technology of trucking, this is the first time the stock market's going to go to the moon. And of course, after the 1930s, it took literally till 1954 to when our stock market got back to where it had been in 1929.
Wow.
And it happened again when we had a bear market throughout the 70s. People thought it was jet airplanes this time. Now we can put our goods and services on jets. We can ship them halfway across the globe. Well, as many times there's smart people that say this time it's going to be different, that simply doesn't happen. History repeats itself for a reason. And I think we have to look and say, well, all these other countries in the past, every single one whose debt to GDP got out of control ended up defaulting on their debt. I know we're the great United States of America, but I think it would be naive to bury our heads in the sand and to think that it can't happen to us. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. We're going to take a quick break right now, but when we come back, we're going to talk about why the economy needs to be voters' #1 concern.
The closing numbers on the markets today. At one point, the market fell as if down a well, over 700 points.
Apple shares are just getting hammered this morning.
We're down by between 3 and 4.5% generally across these markets. Let's talk about the speed with which we are watching this market deteriorate. We're red everywhere, essentially, down by 4-5%.
We're down over 16%. Dow at the same time has fallen about 18%.
The stock market is now down 21%.
Because we're now down 43%.
What in the world is happening on Wall Street?
Finally, there is an alternative. Read David J. Scranton's groundbreaking new book, Return on Principle: 7 Core Values to Help Protect Your Money in Good Times and Bad. Discover practical solutions to the financial challenges facing today's generation of retirees and near retirees. Learn the truth about Wall Street, the financial media, and the secrets they try to hide from everyday investors. This isn't just another book about investing. Working Americans who have lived through 2 major stock market crashes and the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression in the past 16 years don't need another book about investing. David Scranton's approach to financial planning is a holistic system designed for maximum protection, strategic growth, and reliable income regardless of market conditions. Stop planning for retirement with your fingers crossed. Plan with confidence, knowledge, and peace of mind. Read Return on Principle: 7 Core Values to Help Protect Your Money in Good Times and Bad. Available now.
Welcome back to The Income Generation. In this segment, we're going to talk about why the economy should be voters' #1 concern. So, David, why is the economy issue #1 in this election especially?
Well, I think it has to do with our freedom as a country. People don't realize that when a country gets to a point where they're about to default on debt, in essence, their freedoms get reduced.
Right.
The average income earners, middle America, is going to get benefits taken away. They're likely to get benefits reduced in terms of Social Security, in terms of Medicare, in terms of government pensions. This is what happened in Greece.
Right.
High income earners are going to be in a different situation. Their income tax rates are going to go up, so they're going to end up paying a bigger share than they otherwise would have wanted to. And that takes our freedoms away. So what we're trying to do here is maintain our freedoms, which is what we fought for, all these years. In fact, I want to ask you, because I know your goals when you pull the lever in a voting booth are sometimes different from mine. I know I'm biased. I'm in the financial field, so I'm always thinking about the financial side of it and the economy. What are your major issues that are important to you when you vote?
I mean, finances are, of course, important, and it affects all of us. But me personally, I'm all about human issues. I really care about women's rights. I care about, minorities and gays' rights to marry. I really think human issues are important because I think the government should stay out of my personal business and govern. And that's where the economy comes in, I guess.
Okay, all right. So in other words, what you're trying to say is you're much nicer than I am and kinder, correct?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying I really do care about people, though, and I think that people should be able to do what they want and live their life as they choose, as long as
and that's the freedom you're talking about.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I'm sure you're not the only person that thinks that. There's people that are watching our show right now that are thinking, well, there's a balance.
Right, and there should be.
And there should be, that's right. But the plea that I'd like to make is I'd like to say that think about how far we've come with human rights.
Right.
It used to be that you had to be a property owner in order to vote. And now you don't have to be a property owner anymore.
Right.
In fact,
a male property owner.
That's right. I was getting that. You're a step ahead of me. So, we got a feisty one on our hands today. So less coffee for you next week's episode.
Hey,
okay?
I'm a women's studies minor. What can I say?
So there you go. But no, if you think about it, though, we went from only property owners being able to vote.
Right.
And now we have everybody can vote. So even if you don't pay a dime in sales tax or property tax or income tax, and you're on welfare and you're a net taker from the system, you still get the vote.
Yes.
Women's suffrage, we've come a long way there, as you mentioned a moment ago.
Yes.
Have we gotten to equal pay yet for women? Well, not really.
Nope.
But we've closed the gap.
We're talking about it.
We've closed the gap a decent amount. Gay marriages, that just changed recently also.
Yes.
So we've made so many strides when it comes to human rights.
We have.
But think about what our national debt is done, what our deficit is done. Do you know that we've never had a permanent national debt until the Great Depression? Are you aware that we used to use our debt as a credit card, where when we were in a recession, we'd borrow and we'd get ourselves out of the recession, and then during the good times, we'd pay off our debt.
Okay.
So in the last 90 years or so, we've gone the opposite direction when it comes to the economy. Do you realize that?
So more and more and more in debt and not paying anything back.
That's right. And at the end of the day, I think that we've come so far when it comes to human rights that I think the next 4 or 8 years really, really need to be focused on the economy, because even Keynes himself, the father of Keynesian economic theory, said that although I espouse, and I'm paraphrasing, spending money for a government to get themselves out of a recession, he said, my strategies will not work perpetually with any given governmental entity. Eventually, they will fail. And then he quipped that, well, of course, I'll no longer be alive by the time that happens. And I think we're on the brink of having come true exactly what Keynes predicted. So the plea I'd like to make to all of you and to my wonderful co-host here, Ms. Morgan, is just that. Is that we've made so many strides in the human rights side, but virtually none on the economy. In fact, we've gone backwards. To just change our priorities for 1 or 2 election periods to try to get that better balance. That's really the plea that I'd like to make with you.
Yes.
And
viewers?
To our income generation viewers.
Okay.
So the interesting thing here is that America is the greatest nation in the world, in large part because it's the most resilient nation in the world. As a country, yes, we've faced and overcome many major challenges in the past, and I sincerely believe that we're capable of overcoming the ones that are facing us today. But it's not going to happen by ignoring those challenges. It's not going to happen by politicians burying their heads in the sand. Electing leaders who are going to ignore these problems while enacting policies that could actually make things worse is sending us in the opposite direction. I hope that today's show has given you a clear understanding of what some of these challenges are. And Morgan, I hope today's show has maybe just swayed your thoughts just a little bit in your prioritization of your own election issues.
I have to say what you're saying really does make perfect sense, and there's no reason why our 2 viewpoints can't dovetail. Yeah. So you've changed my mind.
Well, good. Well, good. And hopefully more than just yourself, because, some of the potential consequences could be absolutely devastating if we keep moving in the wrong direction. Consequences that could impact you personally, the nation as a whole, and most unfortunately, the next generation of Americans, our children and grandchildren. Ironically, if we do keep moving in the wrong direction, we're endangering the very thing we treasure most as a country, the thing we celebrate every July 4th, and that is our independence. We're in danger of becoming a dependent nation with more citizens who take from the system than contribute to it. A nation beholden to creditors and crippled by debt. If you're watching the show, it means you know that you have a personal responsibility to build a strong, secure financial future for yourself and for the people who depend upon you. Just by tuning in and educating yourself, you're proving that you take that responsibility seriously. So why should you expect anything less from your elected officials? The answer is you shouldn't. So please keep that in mind this November. Now, before we go, I want to thank all of our regular viewers as well as those of you watching for the first time. I hope you'll be back. For more information on today's topic and much, much more, I encourage you to download a copy of my new report entitled Renewable Retirement Resources, the Case for Fixed Income, right after the show. You can find it online at theincomegeneration.com. You can also download a copy of my special report called The Income Generation. I'm David Scranton, and thanks again for watching.